We've got the Supreme Court case coming up in London. What I found curious, well, first of all, we were all surprised it actually got accepted. But what I was really surprised about was that there were 7 Supreme Court judges coming out at their full power. The Supreme Court is 12 judges. But already, if just one comes out, it's a matter of public importance. They announced that it was a matter of great public importance. What do you think will happen? Will we see a precedent? Will we see something change in relation to extradition?
I'd be surprised, mainly for reasons of power. Britain tends to adapt itself to U.S. demands. That's been going on since the Second World War, when the United States effectively replaced Britain as the dominant world power. And the British Foreign Office reluctantly conceded that, as they put it, from now on we're going to be junior partners of the United States. We'll follow along and do what they want. And that's pretty much what's been happening. Whether the judges can break out of that, I don't know, but I'd be skeptical. There could be a lot of pressure on them.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same with Australia.
Australia, it's long been the same. Australia has, rightly or wrongly, considered itself to be protected by being part of the, what's sometimes called the Anglosphere, the English, British, now US-dominated world system. And Australia has provided troops. It's performed all kinds of services. It has military bases, US military bases all over the place. Right now it's just accepting a new military contingent, presumably ultimately based in northwest Australia, oriented towards China, part of the encirclement of China that's going on. For a long time, Australia was considered itself an outpost of civilization threatened by the Asian hordes, so no Asians allowed in and so on. And that's changing now that trade patterns are changing, investment patterns are changing. Australia has a much more, has a foot in each world now and has to make some choices and decisions that it didn't in the past.
Well, we elected a prime minister who could speak fluent Chinese, and he was outed and then replaced by Julia Gillard, and then she has now drawn some of those people who helped put him out, Bill Shorten, Mark Habib, we found that he had very strong relations with the US for a few years and was talking her up, saying she was pragmatic. So we're a little bit worried about the way things are going at the top, but underneath.
That's just what the public should know about. The more they find out, the better, and they can choose themselves.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very dangerous business, though. I think that possibly we're looking at people like Bradley Manning and Julian Assange being made an example of.
Bradley Manning is a particularly ugly case. He's been detained without charges for, I think, about 9 months. He was basically being tortured. That's what it means to be in solitary confinement with pretty ugly treatment. That's the kind of thing we complain about bitterly when it happens in Iran or China and so on. It's happening right here, no charges. He isn't being brought to a civilian court yet, may never be. He's being severely punished, in fact tortured, for claims that, even if they were established, should be a reason for respect, not criminal charges. But they haven't even been, but he doesn't even have charges. So that's really a very ugly case.
Yeah, we seem to have this divide. It's almost like worlds that don't collide, but they're sitting side by side. And the military point of view is just completely different. There's
not the military. Unfortunately, it's the civilian point of view.
Yeah.
I mean, the treatment of Bradley Manning traces right back to the civilian authorities. Incidentally, this is not the worst case. Some of the cases that are that have come up, and I mean, the information is there, but almost nobody knows about them. Some of them are really grotesque. Mm-hmm. Take the first case that came to a so-called trial, namely military tribunal, not a serious trial, the first one under the Obama administration. This case ought to be all over the front pages every day. This is Omar Khader. It's a 15-year-old child. The charges against him are that he tried to defend his village when it was attacked by American soldiers in Afghanistan. So he's therefore a terrorist. He spent 8 years, first in Bagram, then in Guantanamo. After 8 years, he was brought to this so-called trial, and he was given two options. One was to plead innocent and spend the rest of his life in prison. The other was to plead guilty, in which case he would get only 8 more years in prison. His lawyers advised him to plead guilty. He did. He's now back in prison again, Guantanamo. As a Canadian citizen, Canada could easily have him sent to Canada and release him. But they too just don't like to step on the shoes of Uncle Sam. So they're leaving him for another 8 years. That'll be 16 years in prison, and Guantanamo is not exactly a nice place. For the charge of trying to defend his village when he was a 15-year-old kid. This is, I don't know what words you can use for this.
We were just talking last night about Julian Assange, the high-tech terrorist, and the Occupy London people as the low-level terrorist, and we were wondering if there was a happy medium terrorist as well. How can law and justice be based on such a vague term as terrorist? What does it mean, Professor Chomsky?
It means somebody who does things that we don't like. And you can see it very clearly. For example, take the terrorist list. If a person is placed on the U.S. terrorist list, he can be murdered, like even if it's an American citizen. Obama just made that clear. But what's the terrorist list? It's a completely arbitrary set of decisions made by the U.S. government without supervision, without redress. And if you take a look at its history, it's mind-boggling. So, for example, one person who just got off the terrorist list 2 years ago is Nelson Mandela. He's now permitted to travel to the United States without special dispensation. Why was he on the terrorist list? Because the African National Congress was struggling against apartheid, and the U.S. was strongly supporting the apartheid regime. And to the very end, in 1988, the Reagan administration declared that Mandela's ANC was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. So therefore the U.S. had to support South African apartheid in the war against terror. Or take another case, take Saddam Hussein. Iraq was on the U.S. terrorist list, but the Reagan administration decided that they wanted to support Saddam in the war against Iran. So in 1982, they removed Iraq from the terrorist list. Then came Donald Rumsfeld going to Baghdad, famous handshake, support for Saddam, right through his worst atrocities. Longfellow campaigned against the Kurds, the chemical weapons. Not only did the U.S. support him, the government tried to deny that he was doing them, wouldn't allow Congress to issue strong protests and so on. This went right all the way through the 80s. 1982, there was a gap on the terrorist list because Iraq was removed. They had to put somebody on. They put Cuba on, which was in honor of Cuba's being the leading target of terrorism. In fact, in the years just before that, there'd been a rash of terrorist attacks against Cuba, including the downing of a civilian aircraft with 75 people or so killed, and bombings in embassies and so on. So Cuba will go on the terrorist list rather dramatically when the press incidentally knows all these facts, but try to find them. Well, they're not. It wouldn't be objective to talk about this because it's not being discussed by Republicans and Democrats. So therefore, if you talk about this, you're biased, sentimental, maybe anti-American, maybe a terrorist, who knows, terrorist sympathizer. It goes on. When Saddam was tried and hanged, it was for crimes committed in 1982, the same year in which he was removed from the terrorist list, so that the U.S. could aid him in his crimes. And in fact, I assume that the legal staff that was planning this had in mind to keep the charges to 1982. You take a look at the charges, yeah, they were bad, but kind of like a toothpick on a mountain compared with his crimes. If they had gone on to include the real crimes, they would have had to open up the fact that the U.S. was supporting him. And so he was tried for kind of like tax evasion. But all of this is public record. You don't need WikiLeaks for it. What you need is honest commentary.
Yeah. I sometimes think that the social media is like the biggest closet in the world. We're all aware of these things, but as people, we feel that we can't really do anything. Do you think that people can do anything to help Bradley, to help Julian if he goes the same way?
Of course.
What can we do?
It'll depend very heavily on public pressure, which makes a substantial difference.
Mm-hmm.
We have plenty of evidence for that. Yeah. So, for example, to take a case that came out from another leak, which is public, but I don't think it's ever made the media. It's now 40 years, so maybe someday it will. The Pentagon Papers. The very interesting part of the Pentagon Papers is the very last part. The Pentagon Papers record ends in mid-1968. The coverage of the last few months is very revealing about exactly the question that you're raising. The Tet Offensive took place in January '68. It convinced the American military, the so-called wise men, the advisors, that the war wasn't worth fighting anymore. Nevertheless, the president and the military did want to send another couple 100,000 troops there. The Joint Chiefs of Staff objected. They said that if we send more troops there, we'll have a shortage of forces in the United States, where we'll need them for civic disorder control, because there's going to be an uprising among people who are infuriated about the war. Young people, women, minorities, there's huge opposition to the war. So we'll need the troops here to keep order. So therefore, we can't send them. Well, it's a pretty graphic illustration of what a completely nonviolent public protest can affect. It's a dramatic case, for one thing, because of the situation. For another, because it's been kept quiet. Now, that's the kind of thing that people should know. And it came from a leak. Dan Ellsberg, Tony Russo speak of the Pentagon Papers, but it hasn't made it to the public. And that's not because of censorship. It's because of unwillingness to let people know what they ought to know if they want to combat criminal behavior by state authorities.
Yeah. I'm hoping to talk to Daniel when I go back to the West Coast again. It's being set up, so I'll probably get the continuation of that story. I'll try and link that on from your question.
There's plenty of stuff in the Pentagon Papers that never really made it to the public.
Yeah.